How y'all doing? For this book review, I'm going to cover another of Robert Howard's works, one you may not be familiar with, but I think it's important to have in your collection. That is Borak and Other Desert Adventures, published by Del Rey, who brought a lot of the definitive Robert Howard's works, with, of course, Conan, Soloman Kane, Brian McMorran, and all of them. Now, when we think of Robert Howard, we think of Conan and similar stories, which requires action-adventure as well as supernatural and horror elements added to it. However, Robert Howard wrote for the pulps, and not everything he wrote had only those elements in it. Action, yes, and just about all of them. Or, it'd be straight horror and everything. He was a pulp writer. He wrote the stories he wanted to write in whatever he can get it published in. So he wrote boxing stories, which not all of them, some of them, didn't have a supernatural element into it. Now, as saying, this is straight action. Not much, no supernatural elements at all, although there's some superstitions that goes with it. It's more akin to his other collection of Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures. I think in this one there's only like one that has a supernatural element in the stories. The rest are just adventure stories set in various different time periods and are historically based. This one is probably the most contemporary of the collections from Del Rey here. Borak's stories, and the other stories involved, because there's three characters that it goes with, mostly takes place in Afghanistan, give or take a few nearby areas. And I say most contemporary because they're somewhere around late 1910s to somewhere in 1920s, around that area. If you like stories like Lawrence of Arabia and that particular time period, this is a book you want to have. Let's go over the stories here. Now, most of the stories are Borak, who is an American, who is Native American descent. He just goes over to Afghanistan, sometimes in India and other places nearby, and he's basically just gone native. These are his adventures. There's 7 stories involved with him. 3 of the stories involve another character named Kirby O'Donnell, and there's one story by Steve Clarney. Now, at the time, here's the thing: most of these stories, there are about 6 of these, were actually published within Robert Howard's lifetime, between 34 and 36. The rest of the stories didn't get published until somewhere between 72 and 76 originally, when they first get published. And the magazines were not weird tales that had. It was top-notch, complete stories and thrilling adventures, those that were published in Howard's time. Others, of course, were published in posthumously in collections and all that, because Robert Howard's a known name by then. In fact, one of the stories I'll get into, I know at least one, was adapted into a Conan story by Elsbreg de Camp. I'll get to that later. First, we'll go over 7 stories of Borak. Real name Francis Xavier Gordon here, and these are his adventures. The first one is Swords of the Hills. Where Borak, having a special package of information from a man who's chasing him with a small band of men. His enemy in this story is Gustav Hyundai, a Hungarian that's trying to rouse up certain tribes to set up a religious holy war against the Indian Empire nearby. Borak is trying to get to the border there, but he's having a hard time doing it. Along the way, he meets up with somebody who he rescues, and he finds the group of people that may help fight back against Gustav. It is a group of people that are obviously not native there, Afghanistan-wise. They were settled there a long time ago when Alexander the Great was conquering that part of the world. Of course, he can get the help, but he has to convince the leader to do so, the dangers that's about to befall him. The next story is Daughter of Erlich Khan. This is where Borak is seeking adventures of a friend from 2 Englishmen who betrayed him. They hire him to find someone, and of course, the directions they tell him where his friend is nearby this one forbidden land that only a handful of white people ever visited, let them know about. Of course, while they settled in camp for a while, Borak goes out to get some food, and the 2 Englishmen were talking to each other. Of course, there was another assistant to Borak here who overhears it. They attempt to kill him and run off to this city. Borak comes back, and right before his friend dies, tells him what happens, and he's trying to find the 2 men out of vengeance for his friends. Apparently, he's more involved in what these 2 are going to do there, because it involves a young woman here who's worshipped as a goddess. What does Borak know? What does it have to do with him? What do 2 Englishmen want to do with her? Well, read the story and find out. The next story is Three-Bladed Doom. Borak and a few of his companions there are sent off to a land. They're tracking down the headquarters of a group of assassins that have been leaving havoc among many heads of states. Their journey is taking place to Forbidden City, where their headquarters is, and it's not just the assassins that are a problem there. There's apparently a huge conquest about to be taken over. Now Borak has to do what he can with his small forces. Hopefully he can get information out to send appropriate forces to stop them. This is the longest story of the book here. In fact, there's a second one that's half as long at the end here, which both were not published in Howard's lifetime, just FYI. In Hawk of the Hills, an English diplomat, Willoughby, is being targeted by a man who is also trying to kill Borak because he's trying to secure certain trade routes along oases for his gun running operation. The two meet up and try to defend their position through a special fort and see if they can stop the man from accomplishing his goals. In Blood of the Gods, a group of very ruthless men has got word and the location of a man who has lived a life of solitude as a hermit for spiritual enlightenment reasons. Borak, who knows this hermit, is tracing after them and trying to see if he can get to his friend the hermit before these ruthless men come and track him down. Why are they after this hermit? Supposedly he is in possession of some very valuable rubies called Blood of the Gods. Can Borak beat them to the punch, and can he stop them and save his friend? Sons of the Hawk is a story that focuses on Stuart Brent, an American who, upon a dying man's wishes, tells him that he needs to find Borak in Afghanistan and give him information on the nature of a person called the Black Tiger. Well, he goes over there, and along the way he is attacked and is captured by a group of raiders who attempt to sell him in the City of Thieves as a slave. Now, how's he going to get his information to Borak? Well, maybe a lone traveler that hags along with him can help him out. The last of the Borak stories is Son of the White Wolf. A group of Turkish deserters there, fight off their English officers, take their guns, and attempt to start a new empire by raiding other nearby villages, gathering their numbers, and start a new Turkish empire before the rise of Islam in that area. Among their raids, they come across a German woman named Olga, who is in truth a spy. She gets caught up in the mess and eventually seeks the help of Borak. While the two escaping the raiders and staying ahead of them, they seek help through a group of another tribe who's capable of fighting back this force, but at the same time they also want Borak's head for the bounty. The next three stories of the book involve the character Kirby O'Donnell. Two of the stories are connected to each other. One's is you best read one in order to understand the other, but the third one's kind of self-contained. So let's go over those. Gold from Tartary. Kirby O'Donnell, we're introduced to him in the middle of a fierce fight. And at the end of it, he rescues a man who says, I won't forget you here. And after he goes away, Kirby finds among the bodies there a special medallion that is a symbol to an inner circle of a hidden city, Sharazar. This city is known to have this vast treasure which the ruler plans to do some conquest with. And unfortunately for that ruler, he's also got an enemy trying to take over this city so he can gain the treasure himself. Of course, Kirby wants the treasure as well. And in the end of it all, he's got a moral dilemma whether after he, overcomes the enemy, will he, let the new enemy keep the treasure or dispose of it? Which leads to the next story, the Shores of Sharazan. I'm kind of spoiling the end of the first one here to explain this one. But see, Kirby is sent by the new ruler of the city to seek out this Englishman who has information and papers upon him. And he's kind of lost and overtaken by this one tribe in that area. Before Kirby goes off to find him, he's held at knife point by a man who says, okay, I know what you did with that treasure, so here's what you're going to do. When you find that Englishman and or his papers, you're going to give them to me, not the ruler here. So that's his kind of, stuck between a rock and a hard place here as he goes out and, tries to overcome the group of people that has some information to do with the Englishman and or the papers that he has. The next one is the Trail of the Bloodstained God. This is very similar to the Borak story of Blood of the Gods, where Kirby chases an Englishman into a forbidden land who supposedly has this treasure that is cursed to anyone who finds it, but this man is willing to do it for the value that it's worth. The last story is called The Fire of Ashurbanipal. The story involves main character Steve Clarney with his companion Yar Ali. They're wandering the desert and hopeless into this lost cursed temple that supposedly found this huge gem That is the fire of Ashurbanipal. Of course, with such stories, are being chased by a group of men who seek the gem themselves. Is it really cursed? What will happen to those who touch it? Well, I'll leave you to read that and find out. This story here I've actually read in a couple of our anthologies. One was a Cthulhu Mythos anthology. The other one was the horror stories about that. This is the closest one that has any, any supernatural elements on that. I say closest one compared to the other stories. The other stories deal with superstitions that the natives have about certain areas or temples on that, but we find out the nature of those. And this story here is a bit closer to what we expect out of Howard. The artwork in this volume is done by Jim and Ruth Keegan and Tim Bradstreet. Jim and Ruth did the cover and the plates, while Tim did the chapters and in-between art. Jim and Ruth's work really touches on the pulp feel that these stories came from. I remember seeing their work on the Adventures of Two Gun Bob in the Conan comics back when Dark Horse produced them. These were newspaper comic-like strips that illustrates anecdotes of Robert Howard's life based on letters to friends and pen pals. Tim Bradstreet's art is absolutely perfect for these stories. His work shows a photorealistic look in both the characters and the environment. His model for El Borak is the actor Tom Jane, who played the Punisher in the 2007 film with the same name. The artwork complements Howard's writing in showing the characters in a gritty and determined light, and also the barren and exotic landscapes of the setting. Of course, after the end of the stories here, you have Michelina, which has a 2 or 3 pages of an O'Donnell story that's obviously not finished, and then we have a rough draft version of Three-Bladed Doom, which is about half the length of the finished version. Neither of these versions were published during Howard's lifetime, as I said. But if he was to publish it, obviously the finished one was not only the fact that it's finished, it's also longer, so we would have gotten paid more. But with that said, we also have an essay called Gunfighters of the Wild West by David A. Harding. This explores the historical context of El Borak, how he came up with that character, and his sources that would have inspired him to write the stories. Interesting enough, El Borak, while having any published material during Howard's lifetime, is only in the last couple of years before he died. But the concept of El Borak he's been working on since before he was publishing his stories, of desert adventures and all that. But it had its own different forms until he finally came up with a new final form that he of El Borak that we get to read here. Sounds similar to Razor Fist's Night Veil series. It's a concept of a thief character he's had for a long time, but up until the last few years, he was able to finalize it and publish it. So sometimes that happens when it comes to character creations. But this essay talks about not only the concept of El Borak and the influences, it talks about the sources that Howard had and may have had and his time period that influences his fascination and to want to write these stories. Of course, one of them was even historic. Some of them even historical basis. It's like we have El Borak, whose name in the story is his real name is Francis Xavier Gordon. Well, apparently there was a General Charles Chinese Gordon that was more like a good direct influence of the creation of El Borak. And it talks about his deeds and how anyone knows about it. Of course, Lawrence of Arabia, as I said, H. Rider Haggard, who did the Quartermain series, and all this. Now, one of these stories, one of these sources there, talks about, gives a very vivid description of what raiders in those parts of the world did, and you can see that directly shown in, let's see, what was it? Sons of the White Wolf. That story, I forgot to mention this, where during the Turkish deserters, when they did their raids against villages to take resources and women, it really describes the effect of what happened to the people in this village in more detail than it has in any other stories. And it seems kind of odd, and not everybody wants to read that, but it's only briefly described. And here's the thing: you want to talk about danger and all that, things like this have to be shown. They can't all be cutesy in a cartoon. Howard didn't want to write that, Now, the rest of the stories doesn't show that much graphic detail other than the two men fighting and killing as you would normally expect from this. But when you read all the other stories, and then you get to Son of the White Wolf, then you read that scene, it's like, okay, that went a little dark, but if you were there in real life, that's exactly what you would see from such events, from such people. So I think it's a very fascinating thing about that. So yeah, this is now one of the stories here, the O'Donnell story, the Trail of the Bloodstained God. That I did a quick search and not too much deep. Apparently, this story because it was never published. L. Sprague de Camp adapted that into a Conan story years ago. I mean, some of you might have an opinion about that. It's like, how can a man who takes this man's great work and then cannibalize it to another one like that? I mean, it's not like Robert E. Howard would do that, take an unpublished story and change it to something else. I mean, it's not like he would have taken a Kull story that wasn't published in his lifetime and then come up with a new character or use that to create what he's better known for. So, yeah, there's that aspect of that. And of course, you could argue that, well, somebody else shouldn't do that to his other works, even if he has died. Okay, if those are so therefore we should also be interested into strongly. Those who are strongly against that should also be strongly against writers who died and not finished their works. For instance, Frank Herbert's Dune should have stopped at the 6 books, and his son and the other guy who wrote with him should never finish that series. Or Wheel of Time should have been left on a cliffhanger. So I can agree with you, but here's the thing. There are some things I see off and on with L. Sprague de Camp, doing what he did with Howard's work, and yeah, I kind of agree that, not all of it was good. But let's think of it this way. Regardless that, it shouldn't matter. Howard and Sprague de Camp are both gone, but through their efforts, with Howard creating them in the first place, and Sprague de Camp continuing them on in form and fashion through the paperback books, which led to the comics, and kept the posterity of Robert E. Howard's works alive, is why we have these books today in their original form as best as we got. El Borak, Kull of Atlantis, his historical stories, and of course, Conan, Bran McMorn, Soloman Kane. We have him here today through the rough and bumpy rides of all the people who are involved on that. And for those of you who get on with L. Sprague de Camp about doing what he did to Robert E. Howard's work, if we're so much purists, why do we continue picking up anything like the Savage Sword of Conan or any other Conan comics out there? Isn't that in essence just a continuation of what we're getting on to Sprague de Camp about, regardless of how he did it? So, yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Again, you don't have to like what he done exactly with his works, but these were the efforts that happened in this plane into the universe on how we have this Robert E. Howard's works alive today. That's just how it is. However, Sprague de Camp was not a hack. He wrote several good stories that gave him praise throughout that. I like his Via Interplanetaria series. I like his other fantasy stories like Fallible Fiend and all that, or in the Tritonian Ring. He's not Robert E. Howard, no doubt, but he is his own voice, and he does provide entertaining stories in his own fashion. So read his works, and I would say be on a middle ground. The guy had his faults, but he also had his merits. So, digressing quite a bit right there. That's El Borak and Air Desert Adventures. Again, it is not the supernatural stories that we expect out of his horror stories or adventures, Conan and all that, but you need to add this because the adventures alone are just wonderful reads, even with just strict action and nice exotic land. And you get the idea. It's not so much exotic to us nowadays, but imagine yourself as someone living in that time period of the 20s and the 30s. You're not going to travel too much unless you have, unless you were kind of rich and have money and all that. And it's pretty dangerous even then to travel, but you hear about these, exciting adventures in these faraway exotic lands. So, that's El Borak. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.